So first of all, turning to Simon Johnson. Simon, your career has covered two bases on this topic. You've held senior positions within the Jewish community and also within the sports world. What conclusions has that led you to? Excuse me, has that led you to?
Well, thank you, Sam. And if you're comfortable, I've got some remarks that I've prepared, and if that's all right, I'll press on with that if that suits you.
Please go ahead.
I think what I'll do is I'll address the points that you've made there, and then I'm very happy to take questions. And I'm very grateful to UKLFI, Charitable Trust, to Sam, Rola, Jonathan and Caroline for having me here today. I have been out of the Jewish community for 18 months, so forgive me if I'm a little bit rusty on the up-to-date figures, but I do remain in sport, as you have said, and it is fair to say that the sport of rugby league, which I chair, is mercifully free of issues of anti-Jewish racism. And I am going to use the expression anti-Jewish racism, if that's okay with you, because research that we did whilst we were at the JLC was clear that most of the public understood this expression more clearly than they did the word anti-Semitism. Not this audience, of course, but the general public. And even though the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is well understood by this audience, you will be able to see from what it is that I say today that the expression anti-Jewish racism is better for me to make the points that I'm going to make. And what I'm going to cover, Sam, is two different issues. Anti-Jewish racism, which will be the bulk of what I talk about, but I'm also going to touch on the issue of anti-Israel activity, which has the capability of spilling over into anti-Semitism. In my view, it's very, very important that we always keep these two issues separate, as they are very clearly different in scale, severity, and in the way that they're treated. People find both of them egregious, but they have very different impacts. Very often, anti-Israel activity can hide, reveal, or manifest as anti-Jewish racism, but the examples I'm going to give in my few remarks will be very different. In the world of sport, it seems to be quite clearly understood that anti-Jewish racism is a part of racism, and it is important, therefore, in the sport world that we don't try too hard to distinguish or separate the two. They may present differently, and the abuse and the discrimination may have different elements, but essentially, the discrimination, the reporting mechanism, and the offences are the same. There is in the sport world nothing different about anti-Semitism, and it is not treated differently to any other form of racism. Now, in this country, we do have negative connotations around the phrase all forms of racism. It got itself a bad press when used by certain political leaders, but I always have found it very helpful in the sports industry to refer to it as anti-Jewish racism, as it does manifest itself in the same way. Racist language, signs or chanting, abuse and racist insults, racist chanting, either at a professional level, on the pitch, or terraces, or at grassroots level, on the pitch and on the sidelines. It's all part of the same definition in the sports world, and for this part of football discipline and regulation, I believe that it's correct. Now, it is true that Holocaust equivalence, imagery, or denial is unique to anti-Jewish racism, and it is helpfully addressed within the IHRA definition. But the sports authorities seem quite comfortable to include these in the definition of racism, as we're going to see shortly. I think it's also important for us to remember that when we are discussing racism in sport, we're talking about football primarily. Statistically and in terms of impact, in football, anti-Jewish racism is nowhere near as big an issue as racism against Black and Asian people. Racism against Black and Asian people is much more commonplace and is proving stubborn to remove. The anti-racism campaigns that are being run now within the football world are primarily motivated by racism against Black people, and that is right. But it is good to see, though, that all of the football authorities have kept the definition of racism as wide as they can, so that it is clear that it is genuinely trying to catch any and all forms of racism and discrimination. Now, football does have an issue of discrimination of treatment and employment of Black and Asian people, whether that's players, coaches, officials, volunteers, and those by and large do not apply to Jewish people. And as I said earlier, it is also statistically the case that when we are discussing racism in sport, we are essentially talking about football. Incidences of racism in general and anti-Jewish racism in particular are much, much smaller and in some cases minuscule in other sports compared to football. Now, the importance of reporting and of the sports disciplinary processes being robust enough to deal with the reports raised is critical. This issue is just as important for anti-Jewish racism as it is for any other form. And it's very important that participants, fans, and volunteers know about how to report racism and have confidence in the system, whether that's an FA system or the reporting mechanism set up by Kick It Out. For many years, and particularly when I was in football, confidence was lacking in the processes. But my experience is that by and large, there is much more confidence now that reports will be dealt with, that perpetrators will be identified and disciplined than was the case in the past. In fact, it was 3 racism cases involving anti-Jewish racism that have helped the FA and the local county FAs to deal with racism in general more effectively. Because it was the issue of anti-Jewish racism which helped to establish strict liability, strict legal liability for racism cases in 2014 and 15. The first case that did it was the Nicholas Anelka case. Now, you may remember this. Anelka was playing for West Bromwich Albion. He celebrated scoring a goal by doing what is called a cannelle, a sort of inverted Nazi salute. It was a trademark of a notoriously anti-Semitic French performer called Dieudonné. It was an offensive gesture, and Anelka was charged with what was called a gesture that was abusive and or indecent and or insulting and or improper, and that it included a reference to ethnic origin and or race and or religion or belief. So you can see how widely the football authorities have tried to capture this within the definition of racism. Now, Anelka's defense was that he did not intend it to be a racist gesture, but merely one that he saw as anti-establishment. The FA disciplinary panel found, though, that although he might not have intended it to be racist, his intention was irrelevant. If the gesture was found as a matter of fact to be abusive or insulting on grounds of ethnic origin, race, or belief, then the offence was proven. So that case effectively established strict liability for race cases, and Anelka was suspended for 5 matches and fined £80,000. This was quickly tested in another case involving Dave Whelan. The former chairman of Wigan Athletic made a derogatory statement in a media interview that Jewish people chase money more than anybody else. He was charged with misconduct aggravated on grounds of race, religion, or ethnicity, and was found liable and fined £50,000 and suspended for 6 weeks. Again, intent was not considered, and the strict liability was imposed. In fact, the panel specifically stated that they didn't believe that Mr. Whelan was racist, but this case established that strict liability is in place and that regulatory bodies are moving away from issues of intent or having to give an opinion on a person's general attitude to race. A few weeks after that, Mario Balotelli was also fined, playing for Liverpool, and received a 1-match suspension for posting an image that contained the words "jump high like a black man" and "grab coins like a Jew." Again, he was fined for aggravated case of misconduct, and the panel merely looked at the words or image used and not the intent or his general attitude to race. Now, there is a complicating factor at play in football, and that surrounds Tottenham Hotspur and their insistence on calling themselves by reference to a Y word. Now, issues of anti-Jewish racism within the football industry tend to spike around Spurs fixtures, and the use by Tottenham fans to refer to themselves by this Y word appears to be taken by some people to give carte blanche to racists to taunt Spurs fans by reference to it. That is why you will see songs relating to the Holocaust or which use Holocaust imagery and effect to create abusive or insulting behavior or chants. Now, there's been much discussion about this, but I am clear, and I've clearly expressed the opinion both within the football industry and outside, that for as long as Tottenham fans choose to badge themselves according to the Y word, we will struggle to remove Holocaust and racist imagery completely from the terraces. Now, a number of clubs, and Chelsea have been prominent in this, have put in place a wide range of educational, nudging, and disciplinary measures to avoid flare-ups when their clubs are playing Tottenham. But it is certainly around these games and with specific clubs that we do see racist chanting, imagery, and actions that are specifically of an anti-Semitic nature or which use Holocaust imagery or equivalents. Now, outside of football, I just want to take a few moments, Sam, before I finish, to look at anti-Israel activity in sport. It's not racist, but it has the possibility to straddle the border of racism depending on the context. Now, I know that there has been some difficulty in some quarters with the display of Palestinian flags by certain players in matches at the end of the last football season. I think I took a slightly more militant position on this than some others did. As you know, the FA and FIFA prohibit the display of political slogans. In fact, a former CEO of the FA got himself in a mess in a press conference, if you remember, by referring to the Star of David as a political sign. It was my opinion at the time, and I remain of this view, that if a player of Palestinian heritage were to display on the pitch a Palestinian flag, that would not be a political gesture. But when a French player or an African player does it, even if they are of the Muslim faith, they are displaying solidarity with the Palestinian cause, and at that point, this Palestinian flag becomes a political slogan. At the end of last season, I felt the Premier League could have issued some guidance on this, but perhaps wisely, they steered out of it, leaving it in the too difficult tray and hoping that the problem would just go away, which for now it has. Clearer perhaps were the incidents around international competitions in judo and taekwondo, where athletes have refused to compete against Israeli athletes, or worse, where the hosts have not allowed Israeli athletes to benefit from the rights accruing to other athletes in terms of having the Israeli flag or their anthem. Now, I think that it is now accepted, legally and actually, that any host of an international sporting event must allow free passage to all athletes, coaches, and fans of all nations, and grant them the same rights as all participants from all other nations. And if they do not, then they may be in breach of their hosting agreement for the event. Now, to be fair to FIFA, it is a clear condition of the hosting agreement for tournaments that they organise. Athletes who refuse to compete tend to be disqualified, but they are surely in breach of the rules of the sport, and disciplinary action must follow. This is even when they get a mysterious injury that forces them to withdraw just before they compete against an Israeli athlete. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour, Sam, and I hope you found this helpful. I'm happy to take questions now or afterwards, but like you, I'm very happy and looking forward to hearing from Rola on the great work that Chelsea have done and the leadership that they've showed in confronting Holocaust denial and anti-Jewish racism. In Chelsea's case, it has come from the top, and it's filtered all the way through the club. And I think it's been a very welcome position that they've taken.
Thanks, Simon. It was more than a whistle-stop tour, but it covered a lot of bases. And it's going to be excellent to revisit. I've taken some notes of some of them. It's going to be great to revisit them. And a good way to do that is for us to get some questions in the Q&A, which we'll do our best to answer after we've heard from both speakers. So if you could put questions in the Q&A, we might group questions together, we might take them out of order, we'll try our best to do them all. Some of the topics covered were just to go back to the beginning, a very strong position on rebranding anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish racism, which is a very interesting concept that has a lot going for it, and we can talk about that later. I know that UKLFI Charitable Trust's sister organisation, UKLFI, has been very active in the international sports arena, and in the flags, and that's maybe a topic that can come up a little bit later too. But first, we need to hear from Rola Brentlin, who is Head of Special Projects at Chelsea Football Club. And there she leads and coordinates their very active efforts to combat anti-Semitism, or as I should now be calling it, anti-Jewish racism, but the topic of the talk is anti-Semitism. They have a long-term campaign called Say No to Anti-Semitism. It's groundbreaking work. And what we thought we'd do, Rola, is before we hear from you to explain your work and how it's put together, you've made a fabulous video that I've already seen. And we thought it'd be a good idea to share that before we talk to you. So with your permission, I hope that we can now start showing that.
Perfect.
I've experienced anti-Semitism my whole life. I could hear the gunfire getting louder.
Targeting that synagogue.
Police stormed the Jewish supermarket at Antisemitism.
Some hateful reason. Anti-Semitism. 12 have gone up.
Shot. 4 hostages
I
taken.
never thought this would happen.
The human race cannot be stopped by hatred.
This campaign to say no to anti-Semitism, it's really courageous.
Anti-Semitism is racism.
And we won't tolerate it in football or in our communities.
We need to address it through education, through information, through inspiration, and that is the essence of the Chelsea campaign.
To respect everyone is important, so that's my message.
What do football clubs do but play football? So we thought a charity match here at the end of the season in Boston.
Every kid has a hero. Those are football players. To have those kinds of thought leaders and say no to anti-Semitism, this is a game changer.
The power of getting to millions and millions of people, we are very proud of it. We have still our work to do, but we will go until the end.
There is still a lot of hard work to achieve. We should not hate each other.
My dog tag said I was Jewish. It made no difference to anybody. I was just another operational pilot on the squadron.
It's terrible what's going on today. I cannot understand it. We have not learned from what had happened, so we must not give up.
We took the women's team to Israel. They were playing football with 20 Palestinian children and 20 Israeli children. These kids don't hate each other. They weren't born that way. They learned to hate each other, and we can do something about that.
I'm eternally grateful to Chelsea FC to paint on Stamford Bridge. This particular piece, paying homage to the victims of the Holocaust.
We have an owner who's very passionate about this, and I think it's great to really make a statement.
During the Holocaust, prominent sportsmen and women were murdered. Let these stories serve as an inspiration to always fight against anti-Semitism, discrimination and racism, wherever they may find it.
Well, Chelsea has been a pioneer in this effort. What they have done has already begun to show a difference.
I don't think any of us really expected how much the campaign would grow and how much interest from our organizations all over the world.
It's a powerful, powerful message that resonates far beyond football.
It's a very effective video, as I think all of us who've seen it would say. Now, from that, three things came haring through across to me. One is that the enormous social power that football has as a global activity. Slightly one stage back from that is that the enormous responsibility that football has to exercise that power in a responsible way. And thirdly, more directly relevant to your campaign, how other sports organizations can and should be using that responsibility that they should be shouldering and using their power to do the work that you're trying to do. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear more about what you've been doing, and as, just to reinforce, if you find some of the things interesting that Rola's saying you'd like to hear more about, do put something in the Q&A, and we'll come back to stuff a bit later. So Rola, please tell us all about it.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you also to UKLFI for having us, and to Jonathan and Caroline and Simon and Sam, of course. So I think we will try to show the video at the end. I've been chatting with Caroline in the background here, so we'll try again. But very briefly, just on the background to the work we're doing. So Chelsea FC is obviously a Premier League club. But what people might not know what comes with that is that we have approximately 500 million fans worldwide. And about 100 million of those fans are connected to us through various social media platforms. So that is obviously an enormous reach worldwide, way beyond Europe, that gives us and the players quite an ability to try and drive change and to use those platforms to do something good. So in terms of charitable work, when purchasing the club in 2003, Roman Abramovich set an objective to make sure he wanted the club to have a comprehensive community program. So with that background, this foundation was established. It's now the largest charitable foundation in the Premier League. We give back about 2% each year, which in real terms means about $120 million over the past 10 years. So it's quite comprehensive work. It covers everything from supporting vulnerable groups across the UK to soccer schools for kids. We have about 1 million kids that go through our programs each year. Let's see, sorry, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, yes, yeah. I certainly can. I hope everybody else.
Okay, good. So a part of the foundation's work is also a lot of diversity and inclusion work. And anti-Semitism has always been part of that work. But what happened back in 2017 is that Mr. Abramovich, I don't know if you remember 2017, but there'd been a number of really disturbing incidents across Europe, a lot of anti-Semitic attacks. I think we saw a lot of new surveys on changes in attitudes that were very bad. There were incidents also in sports around this, and he wanted to see what can we as a club do more to elevate this. He himself has been supporting the Jewish community for about 20 years. It's a lifelong commitment for him. He's a big donor in Israel and the UK and elsewhere. So he really wanted to kind of elevate the efforts of the club to do something specific. So it's very hard to summarize 4 years of work, but I will try to focus on 4 things that usually people ask me about. One is what we've done with the fans. 2 is how we are addressing online abuse, because as you can imagine, with 100 million followers on various channels, you see quite a lot of abuse there, which also gives you an opportunity to address a quite large chunk of bad stuff online. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're actually using sports history to try to educate about the Holocaust and about ultimately anti-Semitism, and how this work is kind of paving the way for others, and how, I think going back to what Simon was talking about, I think for us, anti-Semitism needs to become or anti-Jewish hatred, as normal to speak about and engage in as racism. It cannot only be Jewish organizations that are involved in fighting anti-Semitism. And Chelsea is a football club. It's very much a non-Jewish group. And I think there are learnings there, not only for sports, but for other groups in civil society, how you can get involved when you're kind of not a community group. So if we start with the fans, there are 2 things there. A is, obviously addressing issues within the fan base, which we have, which I think everyone has. Sports in the end and football is a reflection of society. If you have it in society, you will find it in football as well. There's no way around that. So I think, part of the work was really focused to how do we get rid of this? How do we make it clear to everyone in our club that this is not accepted? And we do not want this in our club, not in our channels and not anywhere. So the first thing we did was, and I think this is important learning, it was not a top-down approach and kind of surprise to everyone that we're launching this. We did quite a lot of pre-work, meeting with all of our fan groups, explaining what we want to do, what the problem is. We invited Holocaust survivors to meet with all of the different fan groups. We also invited them to meet with all of our teams. So the first team, the women's team, the academy teams, to make sure that, you know, there was not only an understanding of what we're trying to do, but to actually put, you know, a human being behind it to, it's, you know, when you meet a survivor, as everybody knows, it does change your perspective. So I think that was, we did a number of these different type of educational efforts. The fans were, I think fans have a bad rep sometimes in the UK. I think it's unfair. It's a small group of, I think, bad people that give a bad rep to a very large group of very good people. And our fans and the groups that are kind of organized were brilliant at all of these meetings. They had so many ideas of how they thought the club could, you know, do more, what type of activities we could do. So we involved them at a very early stage to say, this is what we're going to come out, we're going to do. We want you involved. What role can you play? So that was kind of using that in a positive way. So we've had trips to Auschwitz where fans have been invited. We do regular events in London at, for example, the Imperial War Museum, where Mr. Abramovich is a big donor. We've hosted private events there. So try to involve them in the different type of activities we have. But secondly is with the fans, with the kind of, I think, individuals that are misbehaving, that are either anti-Semitic or just ignorant. We also wanted to take a different approach there. So normally what happens if you have an incident in the stadium or online, you issue some sort of a ban, depending on how severe the case is. Now, if it's a police matter, it's out of our hands, they get a lifetime ban and it's up to the police to manage it. If not, then it's kind of up to the clubs how to manage this specific incident. So I will say the easiest thing to do is to ban, because you ban someone and then it's not your problem. You're pushing the problem elsewhere. Now, what we said is, okay, clearly, you know, there needs to be disciplinary measures, but what responsibility are we taking in trying to make this person stop his behavior? And I think, you know, especially with the Y word and the way, you know, historically how this has played out on the football scene, I think we should be careful labeling people as anti-Semites if they're not actually anti-Semites, because we don't want to create that, right? So in some cases, it is just ignorance, it is stupidity. And hence we introduced this restorative justice program, which we developed together with the Holocaust Educational Trust, where a person who has found guilty of an incident gets invited to go through an educational program with the Holocaust Educational Trust. They get to learn about what their words mean, what impact it has on the community, what historic roots the word or whatever they've done, where it stems from. And depending on the recommendation we get back from Karen and her team, we can then offer this individual to decrease the ban. So there's some positive, it's a stick and a carrot. So we've had very few cases. I think we've had 3 or 4, but those individuals have, you know, been mortified by what they've done, truly, truly ashamed. I think it is, you know, if you've done something like that, then you need to sit in front of people who come from the community. I mean, it is mortifying. So we've had a very good experience of this. And I think those individuals, you know, come back to the club after their ban is up. And I think they have a very different approach and they can actually become ambassadors in fighting this. So I think this model, I would like to see this model scaled so that you're not just banning and pushing the problem elsewhere, but try to do what you can to educate and to give the opportunity for someone to, you know, make amends, basically. So with fans, I would say it's those two kind of paths we're working on. One is where we have an incident, and 2 is using the majority of our fans in terms of promoting this campaign. And I've been, you know, I don't come from the football world myself, like Simon or others does, but I've been quite impressed to see massive Chelsea podcasts and Twitter accounts who are so focused on the game, on transfer markets, on very obviously, football specific things, all of a sudden have special episodes about anti-Semitism and their trip to Auschwitz or an event they participated in. And, I think that's how you generate change. It becomes normal for everyone to speak about this because they're proud that the club is doing this. They want to be part of it. They've learned so much about it. And I think that's how you can create that movement. So with fans, those are two things. With online abuse, it's tricky. As I said, the channels are massive. So what we did this year is take a different approach. And we've basically commissioned an external agency to monitor all of our channels so that we can delete and report on a mass scale, whatever we see there. Antisemitism is not the most prevalent issue we face, but I will say during the European Super League conversations, the anti-Semitic abuse targeting our owner on the channels were massive. So that is something that we saw. We also saw it during the Gaza conflict, where the abuse online on the channels were quite large. We also saw a demonstration outside of the stadium, burning Israeli flags, and kind of all of this coming together. But I think with this new approach we've taken, where it's, first of all, to make it clear to everyone that the way you act online, we will regard that the same way as if you were in our stadium. You cannot be a member of the club, you cannot be a season ticket holder and behave like this online. So the agency is basically able to not only track everything, but identify who is behind it so that we can run it through our systems. And also, if needed, provide this information to law enforcement. And we have done a few name and shame where we publicly announce what we've done. And I think that's also important because in the end, yes, re-educate, give everyone a chance. But when it crosses a line, we just want this out of our club. And I think that has led to more people reporting. I have seen Chelsea fans react to what is written, respond, report, and that's the kind of culture we want to achieve. So I've only been doing this for 6 months with CRISP, which is the agency. It's a massive, massive assignment. I think, it's a lot of money to do this. Obviously, I wouldn't expect every club to do this, but I would like to see long-term, something from the football organizations more centrally offering some type of a service, especially to the smaller clubs and the other leagues, because it's horrifying if you would see the statistics of how much abuse our players get on these platforms. Now, educating through sports history has been, I think, one of the most successful projects that we've done. What we did is partner with a British-Israeli street artist. His name is Solomon Souza. And we developed and we commissioned him to create a number of art pieces around the stadium of Jewish athletes who were murdered during the Holocaust. So, for example, we have a massive mural hanging right at center at the stadium of 3 football players. Now, 2 of them were Jewish. They played in Hungary and in Germany. And the third one was actually a British prisoner of war, Ron Jones, who became known as the goalkeeper of Auschwitz. Now, the stories that these players and individuals represent for a sports audience, it becomes very real because Julius Hirsch played for the national team in Germany. At one point, they actually played at Chelsea at Stamford Bridge. He was a national hero. He was a football star. Any football fan can relate to that because it's the same as the stars they look up to today. And then for a hero at that level, a sportsman to be turned against by his own country that he played for is a very, very hard thing to understand because it's completely, and I think what we're trying to say with that is that this is not something that happens to someone else. Nobody is immune against anti-Semitism, against racism, if it is not stopped in time. So we started with the football players telling their stories, trying to shed a light on the Holocaust and what happened through their life stories. And then that was further expanded to 49 Flames, which is an exhibition and a book we've developed that looks at 15 athletes from across Europe, different disciplines, who all gold medalists, extremely successful within their own field, but all murdered during the Holocaust. So we're again trying to combine the kind of industry we're in with the expertise we have and matching the interest of our audience with Jewish history, which we have found our fans have reacted very positively to read about these men and women from around Europe. And thirdly, paving the way for others. I guess what I want to say there with IRA and all of these things, I think, there is this, I always get asked, well, has anything backfired? Have you been criticized? I think people are a little bit scared because, okay, but what do you say then if you're asked about Israel? I mean, it seems like there's the threshold sometimes seems a little bit high for a non-Jewish organization to get involved. So I think with IRA and with all of these things we've done, what we've been able to kind of show is that, nothing happens. And if you do get criticized or if you get a question, it's not the end of the world. A football club or any sports team must be able to sign a declaration that basically says anti-Semitism is wrong without being scared of this backfiring. And if it backfires, you're still on the right side of history here. You have not done anything wrong. We've had situations where, we took our women's team to Israel. We knew that on social media, this would cause an issue on their personal accounts, but it's okay. It's manageable. We had a meeting with them before. We explained, this is where we're going. There's some issues. You might face something on social media. We had some external expert coming in and explaining it to them. So when we were in Israel and there was actually a coordinated attack on some of their social media accounts, they were fine with it. They knew what it was. They knew how to respond. And they knew that we were there doing the right thing. So I think just with some preparation to always be clear and honest in communication, ensuring that everyone on board on what you're doing, there is absolutely nothing that can backfire from these things. It was the same during the Gaza conflict. We posted in the midst of that something on our social media platform saying that the anti-Semitism, I don't remember exactly, but basically that what's been happening across the UK and in London is absolutely unacceptable and has to stop. Now, I would say 98% of responses to that tweet, and this is not from Chelsea fans, it's just from people in general, were horrific. There were just, it was not really a supportive message we received back. But you know what? That's okay. Because you have to be able to say that it doesn't matter what's going on in Gaza, you cannot beat up a British rabbi. Like, nothing gives you the excuse to do that. And a football club has to be able to say that without fearing that they will be criticized, because there's nothing to be criticized for. So I think what I'm saying with all of this, I hope we've paved the way in the sense that we've done all of these things. We've done friendly matches. We've been to Israel. We've done videos. We've had survivors. We've gone to Auschwitz several times and nothing bad has happened. I think on the opposite, we've created such a much better culture within the club. I think we've been quite recognized for the work that we do. And hopefully, the Premier League has adopted IRA. I'm really glad that happened. We now see other countries, FA, doing the same. And I hope it paves the way to just show that it's good for us to be involved in this, both because we have the issue within our own sport, but also because we have these platforms. And with that, I think comes a responsibility to do the right thing.
There are lots of questions. I've got some of my own. Some of them are quite passionate, which is good. But I'll just start coming off the back of that video, Rola, because we're still in your time. I was wondering, are you a starting point for the world of football dealing with this, or are you just a sort of bright shining light that sits there all alone? How effective do you feel you are in that regard?
Well, I think it's important to say that at least in the Premier League, I think every club is doing good work on equality and diversity. And everybody has, I think, picked their thing. I would like to see more kind of including more about anti-Semitism, but I think, you know, everyone are you know, doing their bits. I don't know if it's purely thanks to us, but I think the fact that the Premier League adopted IRA is a very big step. I mean, you still have organizations worldwide that definitely should adopt it, that are kind of more, you know, that are not. So I think the fact that this massive football body did adopt IRA definitely shows that the world of football is getting involved. We see more and more clubs in Germany, even in Hungary and across Europe, trying to get involved and getting in touch and do things. So I don't think it's only us. I think we probably started it and we invested quite a lot in doing a very public campaign, but we definitely see pickup from teams all over.
Thanks. Now moving on to some questions that we've had in. I meant to say that we're not going to use people's names, which is unfortunate because it means that people don't get credit for their questions that I can already see are excellent. But the reason for that is the video is going to be publicly put up publicly, and it's just not fair to use people's names for all the reasons that especially Rola has been through that have been talked about. Let me start by going back to something that's come through in several questions. Simon, we have some very proud Spurs fans who are very proud, who feel very proud when the Y word is used. And what they would say to you is, do you really think that stopping using that word is going to stop anti-Semitic comments, anti-Jewish racist comments? And why should they? Why shouldn't they adopt that word as a badge of pride?
Well, this is the very reason why it's still being used, because a lot of Spurs fans are very proud about it. And I think you can see that what comes from the top of the club has a great deal of impact. I mean, what's been evident from what Rola has said is that the leadership from the top of the club has led to very significant change being made. To answer that specific question, yes, I do believe that if Spurs stopped having the Y word as a badge of honor, and I think now it's a bit of a dafka, you know, we'll carry on using it because why should we be told not to? I do believe that what you would see is a reduction over time in incidents of anti-Jewish racism, Holocaust imagery, Holocaust chanting, racist chanting around Spurs matches. You wouldn't eliminate it from football, but you would eliminate the flashpoint. And I genuinely believe this. I know other people have a different opinion, and I respect that, but I am convinced that that is the case. The Y word is an insult to Jewish people when it's not used by Jewish people, particularly by Charedim, referring to themselves by that expression. No club would choose to badge themselves by reference to other offensive references, an N-word, a P-word, any of those. And if people were trying to defend that, it wouldn't wash. So I do think we have a difficulty with this. And I do believe that whilst that remains a legitimate and strongly held view by Tottenham fans, I don't think we are ever going to fully conquer this issue. We will make considerable progress, but there will remain a sticking point that will be around matches that involve Tottenham, because that is statistically where, in the professional game, the largest share of the incidents happen.
Rola, it was Simon's point, but do you have any observations you'd like to make on it?
Well, I think in general, it's probably best for Chelsea to not comment on Spurs fans, also for the topic. So I wouldn't do that.
But let me ask you to comment on something else.
Yes.
And that is your campaign is very specific. It's say no to anti-Semitism. Simon has said that we should look at putting it the concept into the wider concept of racism. How do you respond to that? Do you feel that perhaps how do you relate to the point that perhaps that anti-Semitism could just get lost in the wider, because there's so many competing social justice themes that need to be brought out, that if it is just goes into the general mix, it might just not get to see over the wall.
Well, I think for us, it's definitely part of the wider kind of diversity and equality work and under that same umbrella. But I think there are specifics around anti-Semitism which require dedicated work. Just as an example, I mentioned we have about 1 million kids who go through our soccer schools each year. Now, those soccer schools and soccer sessions have a part of them that is dedicated to diversity and equality. So through football, we're trying to teach the kids about, you know, anti-racism messages or why diversity is good. And diversity is really such a base element of the game. We're all different, but we need to play together to win, right? So it's something we do throughout all these schools. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think we've developed a separate section for all of these kids that go through that. And it does require it's a separate history, it's some separate characteristics, but also not just focusing on the negatives. We try to leverage these sessions to teach about the positives of Judaism and what is Hanukkah and other things. So it's not always, you know, surrounded by kind of negative or conflict flair. So I understand what Simon is saying. I think just it can get a little bit lost. So I think at least some efforts, and I think I don't even think we're in a disagreement. I think we're talking about the same thing, but I think from my perspective, it should be as important as racism to tackle it. Then what strategy you use has to be kind of adapted to your program.
Simon, is it an artificial divide?
I think the point I was trying to make, so I'll reiterate it, is that when you're talking to the outside world, it's quite helpful. They don't understand what anti-Semitism is. But they do understand it when you call it anti-Jewish racism against Jewish people. And we found, particularly in political things that were going on the last few years, that was a much better way to do it. And the point I was making is that, interestingly, the football authorities do not make a distinction. It is caught under the definition of a racially aggravated offence. And that, I think, is right. That is the right way to deal with it from a disciplinary perspective. I think the focus of Chelsea's campaign is specific, and therefore in that respect, it's entirely right. So I'm not saying it's wrong to use the word anti-Semitism. I'm talking in a broader term about how it is generally better for people who are new to this issue to understand it as anti-Jewish racism, which makes it more accessible to them. And that is the way that the football authorities have tended to approach it from a disciplinary perspective.
I've got to tell you, we've got more comments on Spurs and the Y word. I'm not going to revisit that at the moment. So I'll just let you know that the feelings are still running high on it. We've had questions about the law, and Simon, you especially have raised a couple of points about strict liability. My understanding is that you were referring to the rules of the game in that. We've got a big legal audience. How do you feel that the legal environment is on this? Is it best dealt with by regulation, or is there more scope for legal?
No, I actually believe that it should be dealt with under football disciplinary rules, and in fact, football's own disciplinary rules do require that. It is comprehensive. They try to make it as comprehensive as possible, and courts are actually quite unwilling to take issues on any matter that could be dealt with by the regulatory and disciplinary processes of the sporting authorities. So in the case of football, the rules are robust enough. The punishment is robust because if the offence was conducted in a football environment, then the punishment can relate to that football environment. Now, I know some people think that it should be done criminally, and the police will look at these things, but in some of the very high-profile cases, not involving anti-Jewish racism, but racism in general, and particularly the case that involved John Terry and the accusation of racist abuse against Anton Ferdinand during a match. If you remember, the courts held consideration of the criminal matter pending the outcome of football disciplinary matters. And they almost gave a sort of a primacy to the way that football will deal with it themselves. Certainly football itself has drafted its rules in such a way that it tries to deal with all of these matters within their own regulations, with appeal structures there. And it's only once it goes outside that, or where the offence is so egregious that it so clearly involves a breach of the criminal law rather than a breach of disciplinary regulations, that the courts would get involved.
Rola, I just wondered if you'd had any thoughts about the legal environment on your work at Chelsea.
Legal environment. Well, we've recently had quite a lot of conversations with the police and others, but I think what Simon is saying is, well, I can't comment on all of it, but I think from our perspective, when there is an incident involved, we always try to first understand if this is criminal or not. And we pass that information on to the police directly. If it's not, and if they can't deal with it, that's when we start properly investigating internally. I think the issue we're experiencing is online, where I don't think there's enough tools and funding, or I'm not even sure where the issue lies, but tackling the online abuse that players, staff, owners, everyone really are facing today, that's a big gap.
So that would involve regulation by and of the social media companies. It's by the sound of it.
Well,
yeah, I don't see how else it would be fixed. I mean, the money we're spending just on moderating our channels is ridiculous, and we're doing that because we have an owner that cares about these issues and he gives us the budget. Not everybody has that privilege. So then all of these, why is a hashtag Hitler was right left on Twitter for years? How is that possible?
If I can just jump in on that, I mean, the general point about social media is not just around anti-Jewish racism. There's a wide range of issues that the social media companies are not dealing with. And I think the online harms bill that is about to wend its way through Parliament is intended partly to address this. But it's a very, very controversial item, because that is trying to put legal liability onto a set of organizations that have spent their entire existence trying to claim that they have no legal liability, trying to claim that they are simply a platform and they're not publishers and they're not responsible for their content. And I think that argument is not sustainable anymore. And I think that there definitely will be legal intervention through the online harms bill. And it remains to be seen how effective that is. But Rola is absolutely right. The social media is where the bulk of the most egregious abuse now comes from. If it comes from the terraces, then it is dealt with either by stewards or the police. But if it's on social media, it's like the Wild West, and it's very, very difficult to find the people who can do it. Not impossible. There's been a case reported today, I think, where people who abuse the England footballers who miss penalties on social media have been, I think, dealt with by the criminal system. But it's very difficult.
Just to clarify, we've had a question that I think you already answered, Rola, but I'll just clarify it with you anyway. The anti-Semitism, the Say No to Anti-Semitism campaign, is that part of a wider anti-racism strategy, or does it just stand alone? Do you deal with other issues of racism or not?
No, it's part of a wider.
That was my understanding.
Yeah.
Now I'm looking at the time. We have 4 minutes left. I think we've got enough for another hour at least, just with my questions, never mind anybody else's, which I haven't asked. But with those 4 minutes, we have to turn to the elephant with a Star of David on it in the room. How do we deal with, how does it operate, Israel and anti-Semitism? It was raised by Simon, but the complexity of being anti-Israel and where that merges and is used as an excuse into anti-Semitism, how is that dealt with? I know it's a huge question for 3 minutes, but if you could, maybe Rola, if we start with you, where do we go?
I think IRA is a great start. I mean, for an organization like ours, we can't really, get in too deep into, I think, that issue. I think IRA is great. It, I think, very clearly specifies when criticizing Israel goes to actually just being hiding anti-Semitism. And for us, we choose to follow that definition. And if we have incidents, then that's what we would look at to make our decision on what it is.
Sam, I don't think it's complicated at all. I agree with Rola. The IRA definition now is very clear on this, and so many organisations have adopted it that I think if people do stick to that, then it is clear where and how it can stray across. And I think it's really important that those of us who campaign and care about this issue do follow the IRA definition on this, because it really is helpful in that respect. And certainly as somebody who has advocated for IRA in a number of places, I know that people who read the IRA definition, have adopted it, they also find it helpful.
So what's coming through for me as we're running out, we've probably got time for another question or two, but is that education is as much it's a question of understanding as much as anything else.
I do think that education is a huge part of it. Rola will know that at the heart of the Say No to Anti-Semitism campaign is education. It's using players and high-profile individuals to educate on specific subjects, and you know that has to be a major part of it. When I was working in football, we always understood that you had to use both education and a robust disciplinary system to have an impact. And I do still believe that that is the case. You can do all the education in the world, but if the people who are breaching the rules just get away with it, then it's going to act to the counter impact on the education that you're doing. So education is important, but it must also be accompanied by clear rules, enforced rules, by a reporting mechanism, and by confidence being built in the system that if somebody does find that something has happened, that the authorities will deal with it robustly.
And Rola, how have you seen the impact of education? I mean, you talked about visits to Auschwitz, which was interested one of our questioners. How have you seen the impact of education in action?
No, I think it's been massive. As I said, I mean, I'm so impressed by the way our fans have taken this campaign to heart, because the way they speak about this issue, I think, is very different than how they would have been able to speak about it a few years ago, because they've been to these visits, they've seen the videos we've produced, they've seen the players, and the players have learned a lot as well. I mean, don't forget, they've also learned a lot about this issue. They speak about it, which means they have to know more about it, right? So I think the educational part is, shouldn't be, I agree with Simon, you need both, but I think, we go through school and we learn things, and at some point, I think, the learning stops somehow, and just using different types of examples to try to shed a light on what happened. We've done one interesting thing I'll just mention briefly. We work with the Royal Air Force Museum on this project that we've developed called Hidden Heroes, which tries to find the stories of Jewish personnel in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. There was a huge, huge part of the Royal Air Force were Jewish volunteers. And within the club, we found fans whose grandparents or parents were actually Jewish pilots and flew in the Royal Air Force. So we've been able to combine the two and actually have them come speak to fans about their grandparents and what they did and how they served this country to defeat the Nazis. So I think there's, you can do education in so many different ways, but I have 100% seen the impact it's had on our club, the culture, the fans, how involved they are, just serving as great ambassadors.
Clearly, groundbreaking work that can be an example to others as well. We have rushed through an hour. We have certainly filled an hour. We could have filled a lot more. Simon Johnson, thank you very much. Rola Brentlin, thank you very much. And to the audience, please look out for the next UKLFI webinar. There are plenty of others on which can be accessed via the website, and this one will be joining it shortly. Thank you very much. Good evening.